All right, good morning. Pastor Justin asked me to talk about the worldwide flood, or emphasize it here this on Creation Emphasis Weekend, because he's in Genesis and has been covering those chapters. So what I'm going to talk about during our Sunday school learning time is what I think is the most dramatic demonstration example of what happened during the worldwide flood that's happened probably in the lifetime of 2 or 3 generations. And it happened in 1980 at Mount St Helens. Now, what I'm going to do is put this whole thing in context. Everything, that is the key event of all world universal history, because everything on this planet changed from before and after that flood. And if you leave that event out of your thinking, that the entire world was flooded by water about 4,500 years ago, you are guaranteed to misinterpret everything about history. If that flood happened, it would have ripped up the rocks, the fossils, the trees, the plants, everything on this planet, washed it around, redistributed it. It would have laid down the rock layers very, very rapidly over a year-long period. And it wasn't 40 days and 40 nights it was over. It lasted for a whole year, with repercussions that lasted for centuries afterwards. You're going to misinterpret the rocks and the fossils. You're going to misunderstand how old things are. You're going to leave a key event of history out, and you're going to ignore an enormous amount of what the Bible has to talk about. So you're both distorting the Bible and distorting your view of the past. But was it real? That's what we're going to look at this morning. Now, there's a verse in Psalm 134 that says, "One generation shall share the mighty acts of God with the next generation. They shall declare his mighty acts." Now, there are really 7 enormous supernatural interventions of God in all of universal history. And I'm not going to belabor this, but the first one was creation. It had to be a supernatural event. And we're going to talk about that at sermon time. The creation of matter, time, and energy, the creation of life, those all couldn't have made themselves. It couldn't have happened naturally. There's the entrance of death into creation, because we're clearly told God, after 6 literal days of creation, resting on the 7th, he declared that everything he made was not just good, but very good, which is a really weird way to describe a billion years of death and disease and bloodshed and extinctions, if that's the reality of the past. But that's all based on believing those rock layers form very slowly, and those rock layers are filled with death and disease and bloodshed. So what we're going to talk about is, where did those rock layers come from? And it's that third mighty act of God, which was the flood. So the third big thing we come to in the book of Genesis. First is creation. Second is the fall of man that brought death into creation. Then comes the flood. And after that, people spread out, and we get all the different nations and nationalities and people groups of the world developing within the last 4,500 years as people with different languages spread across the earth. And obviously, the mightiest act of God, and even in concept, it's almost incomprehensible, that the God who created everything in the entire universe would become a human being and take that penalty of death upon himself. I mean, that's just incomprehensible. No other religion even remotely considers that sort of thing. And it's exactly what the whole story of the Bible is all about. And there's going to be a wrapping up period. Because there's been a beginning, there's going to be an end. And the Bible spends more time talking about that and the return of Christ and those kind of things that are going to be happening that does his first coming. But let's talk about the flood. Now, we're going to start with just fossils. There are trillions of dead animals locked in the rock layers of the earth. Now, this is one of them. It's a solid rock. Used to be a critter that lived at the bottom of the ocean called a trilobite. And I bought this one for a couple $100 a few decades ago. But you can find all sorts of fossils during sermon time. I'm going to talk about this one, which is one of the most common fossils we tend to find. Bought it on eBay for about $20, and I'm going to pass that around later and tell you what it is. But nobody picks up a fossil and holds it up to their ear And if they listen, really, really close, like a seashell, they don't hear it say, 100 million years ago, I was crawling at the bottom of the ocean, and I died. Oh, really? What happened? A rock hit me in the head. Now, they don't talk. There's no label attached. There's no movies. Everything is interpretation. And we're going to talk about the power of interpretation in a moment. But people are so conditioned through schools and movies and books and the internet and museums that when they even hear the word fossil, they immediately connect it with evolution. And they immediately connect it with enormous time periods. Now, there's a big issue that most people have never even thought about. And that is fossils aren't even forming today. When a tree dies in the forest, it never turns into a solid rock. It turns back into dirt. An example I love to show is that only about 150 years, 170 years ago, in the Great Plains states, there was an estimated 100 million buffalo roaming around in Kansas, Nebraska, North, South Dakota, huge areas of enormous plains with no trees. And buffalo hunters discovered if they identify and can shoot the lead buffalo, the buffalo just stand there and mill around. They haven't had an election to elect a new leader, and they'll just start shooting them and shooting them and shooting them. And in a period of about 50 years, they drove them to the point of extinction, and they skinned them and left their bodies to rot. So 100 million enormous beasts were left laying there on the ground. There's not a single fossilized bone. None of them turned to fossils. Never happened. When a fish dies in a fish tank or a lake or an ocean, it never turns into a fossil. It just gets picked apart and eaten, and there's nothing left. And yet there are trillions upon trillions of plant and animal bodies that have been fossilized in the ground. The second thing is it doesn't take a long time for fossils to form. Here's an example. Over in Australia, in the 1920s, they had a mine. I don't even know what they were mining. But one of the miners, as the mine was closed because the Great Depression hit, he left his leather hat laying there in that mineral-laden water. It's just water flowing past the hat filled with minerals. They reopened the mine in the 1960s, so about 40 years later, 30 to 40 years later. That hat had turned into solid rock. Every molecule had been replaced with minerals, silica and manganese and all sorts of minerals you find in mines. The water's flowing through all the rock layers. It's the original OSHA hard hat. But it doesn't take millions of years. It just takes the right conditions. And again, I'm going to hit on that even more later. So why are very intelligent people, I mean geologists, anthropologists, biologists, geneticists, the people in the education establishment are not stupid. They're very intelligent, very smart. They've studied their areas of expertise extensively, and yet they're coming to a 100% opposite opinion and conclusion than what the Bible would tell us is reality. Well, the reason is everybody has a bias, and they're trained to think in a certain way. Whether you realize it or not, from the little child on up, you're being trained to think in a certain way, the way people around you have been taught and trained to think. And people will interpret evidence based on what they believe to be true. And they can often be interpreted different ways. See, we all have those same rocks and rock layers and fossils, but if you start with an assumption that things didn't just appear here on earth, and that's what God tells us, by the way. He said one day he made all the plants supernaturally by intelligent creation upon the earth. Another day he made all the land animals. On the sixth day he made mankind. It wasn't there and then it was there. And it's very clear language, and it's referred to over and over again in the Bible as a reality of history. Now that's absurd to the academic world today. They assume people didn't just appear. The only other option, the only other possibility is that something that wasn't a person turned into a person. So it's assumed to be a fact because you rejected the other possibility as a possibility. And you've trained people generation after generation to not even consider that. Same thing with the rock layers. If you assume evolution's a fact, and that's repeated over and over and over again, and you'll see it in all the textbooks, even little board books for non-reading toddlers, they'll show animals changing and dinosaurs having been around for millions of years, and it's just promoted. Well, then that person becomes a geologist, an anthropologist, a paleontologist. They're going to look at those rock layers. They're going to interpret them based on what they believe to be true. They're going to look at the data. And there is a general tendency in the rock layers. Nowhere do we find what's called the geological column, where down low you tend to find, like that trilobite I just showed you. It's a real heavy shell kind of creature. It lives at the bottom of the ocean. Above it, you tend to find more complicated shells and things. You tend to find fish and things with backbones, then amphibians, then coal seams and dinosaurs, and finally mammals. Now, nowhere do you find that whole sequence. It's kind of pieced together here and there around the earth. But there's a tendency for sea creatures to be lower, land creatures to be higher. Charles Darwin comes along and he says, see, this proves that some simple form of life like a bacteria turned into the first protozoa that turned into like plants that were crawling around in the ocean, and sponges. And those turned into more complex shell creatures that turned into fish, that turned into amphibians, that turned into land animals and mammals, and finally people. And he just lines them up. Now, nobody saw that happen, and we've never, ever seen in a laboratory any basic body structure change into a different body structure. We just see variations within a type of animal, which is exactly what God said. 10 times in God's Word, in the very first chapter, 10 times, it says birds reproduce after their own kind. Fish reproduce after their own kind. Trees reproduce after their own kind. That means lots of variety is built into the DNA code, but the basic body structure isn't going to change. Now, that's really clear. It's crystal clear. It's just, are we going to choose to believe it or not? And the evidence actually supports that. It's like tricycles are a basic kind. Motorcycles are a basic kind. Lots of variety. Automobiles are a basic kind. Lots of variety. But you're not going to change a tricycle into a motorcycle just by randomly throwing parts at it or randomly changing the computer program in the factory. It'll never happen. Only intelligence can add things that weren't there before. Now, there's another possibility that there was a worldwide flood, and that's what laid down those rock layers. That's what laid down the dead animals that got trapped in the sediment that turned into the rock layers. And it all happened recently and rapidly. But that's not even considered as a possibility in anybody trained in the Western world in their education system. It's totally left out. They're not even allowed to think in those terms. So this is the evolution story, that coral and clams and trilobites, they lived about 400 million years ago, and then as the rock layers slowly accumulated, 300 million years ago, you got fish and plants, and then eventually you got things with that crawled up on the land about 200 million years ago, and the age of the dinosaurs was from there until about 100 million years ago, and dinosaurs started turning into mammals. And then eventually mammals appeared, and slowly their brains got bigger and bigger, and they decided if they drop out of the tree and plant some barley and hops, they can brew beer and become people. So there's the great grand scenario of reality that the world lives by. It's actually fantasy. It's not reality. It's just throwing things into an interpretation that allows you to leave God out. And even tons of Christians get pulled into it because it's promoted so authoritatively. Well, what would have been happening if the whole world was flooded? Enormous tsunami waves, massive continental movement instead of this slow, gradual grinding apart that we see today. Tidal waves washing across continents. Everything being ground up by incredibly energetic water. And there's mechanisms to show how this could have happened. We talked about it last night. What you would find, there's the same stuff buried, billions of dead things that died during this flood, buried in sediment that turned into rock layers, all of it laid down underwater, found all over the earth. And that's exactly what we find. And what would have been buried first would have been the things buried that were living deepest in those original ocean basins, as sediments burying them deep. And then as the ocean temperature salinity changes, lots of things go extinct. They get buried a little further up in that ocean water. And as the water starts to cover continents and all the vegetation's being ripped up and floating around and more stuff gets shoved on top of them, you start to form coal seams. And animals trying to escape that are mobile are going to be buried highest of all. Same rocks, same fossils, same layers, two explanations. How do you know which one's right? You got to look at all the data and not assume you know the answer to begin with. Now, that's what the flood would have caused. Fossils worldwide. Extensive rock layers that cover entire continents with perfectly flat seams as this water filled with sediment is just scouring off the land surface, and as it slows down, it sorts and drops out the sediment. In a certain stage, it's filled with the dead animals. Coal packed down underneath of sediment that turned into vegetation, that turned into coal. And as the continents near the end period of this flood started to rise up, and they would have been a lower density, in the ocean basins, which were mostly formed by lava flowing out from the mid-Atlantic ridge, forming new ocean basins, shoving the continents apart, cooled, they would have become denser and started to sink down. Water would have rushed off the land surfaces, carving out enormous river valleys. And all over the world, that's exactly what we find. Enormous river valleys with little rivers at the bottom of the valley. The rivers didn't make the valley. It was all that sediment washing off the continents that found low areas, soft areas, carved out valleys, and left a drainage plain, which became a river as that water was gone. Another interesting thing, every continent, Europe, Australia, North America, South America, it's surrounded by what's called a continental plate. It's very relatively shallow areas of rock, sedimentary rock, made with lots and lots of sediment. That's just sand and dirt and clay and stuff that's been washed off the continents, that extends out for hundreds of miles past the edge of the continent. And then it drops off thousands of feet and goes into the deep ocean. Where'd all that sediment come from? That's the stuff that got washed off the continent at the later stages of the flood, leaving all this erosional, drainage-looking stuff that we see out west of a massive flood that washed off the continent. And the continents, as they were rising, created the various mountain ranges we see. And because of all this volcanism, all this land movement, the oceans were much warmer after the flood. Warmer oceans, lots more evaporation. That came down as snow in the north, more rain on the equatorial regions. So Egypt, Israel, all these lands were lush green paradises for hundreds of years after the flood. Moses, when he sent spies into Israel, said it was a land flowing with milk and honey. They came back with grapes so big they had to be carried between a pole on two men's shoulders. It was a paradise. Now it's a desert. That's because it was the later stages of the Ice Age. But the ice built up to the north and to the south, and it wasn't until the oceans cooled that ice started to melt and the water flowed back into the oceans. That's where the Ice Age fits. See, it's like a big puzzle. See, if the past is a puzzle, have you ever tried to put together a big jigsaw puzzle? And what do you start with when you put together a jigsaw puzzle? Start with a border. And you're constantly looking at the picture on the front. Here's the picture for the front of the puzzle of the past. And if we leave the picture out, it is really tough to put together a puzzle. And that's why the answer is all wrong, because the world has refused to believe the picture is true. Now, let's look at what I referred to at the beginning. What I think is the most stunning example of how we can know which one of these models is true. Because the flood, you can't repeat it. It was a one-time event. And it was beyond almost human comprehension, the scope of this flood that destroyed this earth. So geologists aren't trained to think in those terms. But sometimes there's things that happen that give us a little picture to the past. And one of these things was at Mount St. Helens. Now, this is the picture at Mount St. Helens in 1979. It was a beautiful 16,000 foot tall mountain. And I keep forgetting my laser doesn't work. It was snow covered year round, had a beautiful lake down below it, big resort area. Now, Mount St. Helens is one of a whole series of volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest. You know, Mount Adams, Mount Hood, they were all volcanoes. Matter of fact, there's a ring of volcanoes that goes around the Earth. The Earth cracked at some time in the Earth's history, all the way from Alaska down through Oregon, Washington, California, down the Chile, Argentina, and then wrapping up through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There's called the Ring of Fire, where enormous amounts of lava have poured out of the earth, covering the Pacific Northwest. Australia is covered with lava. A large part of Africa is covered with lava. The whole ocean basins are covered with lava. It flowed out at some time in Earth's history, and it was during the flood. That's part of the fountains of the Great Deep, and that's when these mountains formed, later stages of the flood. See, the water didn't have to cover Mount Everest, didn't have to cover the Rocky Mountains, because they didn't exist before the flood. Those continental plates jammed together, forcing up the Rockies, forced India, slammed into Asia, shoving up the Himalayas at the later stages of the flood. And that's when these mountains were forming. Well, Mount St. Helens became active in 1979. There was like this puff of smoke, got the geologists who study volcanoes. They actually have a special name. They're called volcanists, and they're not from the planet Vulcan with pointy ears. They just like volcanoes. And so they start moving in. Into November, December, there are more little puffs. You can see the gray ash on top of the snow. Here's another one. January, February, there continue to be just little releases of ash from the mountain. But by April, they had put surveying peaks. They could use lasers to measure, and they could see that the mountain was growing 5 foot every day wider. And the next day it's 5 foot wider, and the next day it's 5 foot wider. And over 30 days, it's gotten 100 foot wider. So they know magma's coming up, pressure's building up, something's going to happen. They evacuated the whole area. Well, on a Sunday morning, and I just think this is kind of cool, because this is something God has used to change hundreds of thousands of people's opinions on the trustworthiness of the Bible. It's an absolute disaster to this area. If it had happened on a Monday through Thursday, there would have been thousands of people lumbering timber in the exact path of where this mountain blew up. Because it was a Sunday, there was only a few dozen people that died instead of probably hundreds or thousands. But Sunday morning, the sun is coming up. There's a survey planes flying around, so it's looking directly at a full sunshine shining on the mountain view, and it takes this picture. Now, the whole top of the mountain, because it was so unstable, an earthquake hit, kind of shook the top of the mountain, allowing the sediment to loosen enough for all of this like almost 1,000-degree steam and ash to come shooting out, blend with all that dirt and rocks and sediment at the top of the mountain, and it turned it into a fluid. This is the top of the mountain. The mountain used to start here, and it went up probably another 500 feet, peaked and then came down, and all of that area, about the top third of the mountain, turned into a liquid. It's called fluidizing a solid. So much energy, so much movement that everything just flowed like a real thick mud down into the valley. And they estimate that it was moving at about 120 miles an hour by the time it hit the bottom. Now, that allowed the hot gas and steam now to have an open vent into the atmosphere, and for the next 6 hours it continued to erupt, spewing out enormous amounts of ash. Meanwhile, this mud, which is essentially what it is, it's melted steam and melted snow mixed with all sorts of dirt and stuff, just flows down into the valley. As that gas cloud built, it's shooting out. You see these little streaks? There are rocks at the end of each of these streaks, maybe half the size of this building, that are being thrown 5 miles away. Now, there's a photographer 6 miles away. The gas cloud is now just starting to hit the first ridge, which is 4 miles from him. This second ridge is 2 miles from him, and he's standing 6 miles from the mountain itself. And he's taking pictures pretty much as fast as he can. Then he takes this picture. The gas clouds now reached the 2 miles from him spot. He's taken this picture, and he's thinking to himself, I think I probably have enough pictures now, because this stuff's it's 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit heading right for him. And he said later he assumed he was dead. He actually took this over his shoulder as he's getting into his truck to drive down the mountain road. But the ridge he's on reflected the heat upward as he was heading downward. By the time he got another several hundred yards, he said it was like driving at midnight with no headlights. And he just had to slow down to a creep and every time he'd feel the edge of the road, he'd adjust, but he got away and he survived. Now, here's the mountain in full eruption. There's the amount of energy. By the way, they calculated how much mass was leaving, because of the estimated thickness of the ash and where it went, and how long it lasted, how much energy it would take to move that much weight up into the atmosphere as far as it went. And they estimate the amount of energy was equal to one of the atomic bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima every second. Atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb for 6 hours. Now, this is a very small little inky-dinky eruption. And I want to put it in perspective. The ash spread over Idaho and out into Montana. It was about 6 foot deep near the mountain of powdering all the way over in Montana. Here, a classic picture in full eruption. Here's Mount St. Helens. If you were to gather up all that ash, it would be equivalent to a pile, and I'm going to use miles instead of kilometers, but let's just say 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile visually. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot of material, okay? Well, just 100 years earlier, there was a mountain in the South Pacific, a little island in the South Pacific. It totally obliterated this island called Krakatoa. When that volcano went off, it put out almost 20 times as much ash. So it's a volcano 20 times bigger. So I want to put this in perspective, okay? When Krakatoa erupted, 140 years ago, it sent that ash all the way up into the stratosphere and is spread around the entire Earth. So that happened in the late spring. In the summer in Europe, on the other side of the world, the temperatures were lower than they normally were in the winter. It was called the summer that had no summer because of a volcano, one volcano on the other side of the Earth that erupted. The average temperature on Earth didn't return to normal for 3 years because of one volcano. Now, in perspective to what God's talking about, the fountains of the great deep broke forth. Remember I said most of Australia, a big part of Africa, the Pacific Northwest, most of the oceans are all lava that flowed out during the flood. Most of this lava, you can show it flowed underwater. Yellowstone has a single volcano, the top, a caldera. That's that big round area at the top of a volcano. It's 20 miles in diameter, one volcano. So what we're seeing at Mount St. Helens, and I'm about to show you, visually, I want you to think about if I had an eyedropper and I pulled some water and I took it and I dropped just a single bloop drop of water into an Olympic swimming pool. The Olympic swimming pool's the type of volcanism that was happening during Noah's flood. That drop of water is about what you're about to see. So this is just a little tiny picture of what was happening across this entire planet during Noah's flood. Here's Mount St. Helens before the eruption. That's what it looked like after the eruption. Total devastation. There is nothing left. No trees, no vegetation. The blast wave 20 miles out snapped every tree off like a toothpick just being snapped between your fingers. The ash covered everything. That much of the mountain flowed down into the valley below it. And as it flowed down, it came down and, hang on just a second, I want to go to the schematic. It split. About half of it flowed down the valley this way with the debris flow. The other half of it slammed into this great big lake I showed you initially, beautiful big resort area. It shoved every drop of water out of this lake. These hillsides right here that you're looking at, they're about 800 feet tall. That water, that tidal wave, slammed into those hillsides, 500-foot tidal wave. It ripped up every tree, every bit of soil. It eroded erosional ruts instantaneously right down into solid basalt. And then it flushed it all back down into the lake again. The lake is now several hundred feet higher. The bottom is several hundred feet higher than the top used to be because all that sediment then was laying down in that lake where it used to be. And we're going to talk about some of the things that happened as a result of that. Now, the first thing is all this sediment flowed down. Remember, it's mixed with 1,000-degree Fahrenheit steam and hot gases, just vaporized water, lots of it. And it's carrying that stuff down into the valley, and it's burying that steam. Well, as that steam kind of finds little crevices and niches and comes together and forms pockets, it gets enough energy that it will then burst upward. And when the steam bursts up out of the ground collapses down. That's part of the things that were happening. They're called steam explosion pits. And they might happen minutes after everything settles. Some of them wouldn't happen days later. A helicopter would be coming over, and this is actually a picture several days later. All of a sudden, a bunch of steam comes bursting up out of the ground. And when it comes up out of the ground collapses downward. Now, this is ash that's settled on top of the sediment. That stuff is the sediment that flowed down into the valley, this thickness here. This used to be smooth all the way across. From here to there was just a completely smooth surface. The steam burst up, the land collapsed down. Now, why am I showing you this? Because geologists are trained to think in a certain way. Anywhere in the world where they go and they see these creviced, erosion-looking cliffs, like with all these little crags and lines and marks, they are trained to think over huge periods of time, usually millions of years, rain has come, or there's been freezing and thawing or hail, and it just kind of erodes away at the rock surface. And rock is hard, so it takes a long time, and eventually you form these new drainage patterns. They have a name for it. They call it the Dendrinic drainage pattern. And they see this, and they're trained to think millions of years. Been a lot of time for that to form. That took about maybe 30 seconds to form. As the steam burst up, the land collapsed down. And you got exactly the same looking drainage pattern. See, it either takes a lot of energy and very, very little time, or a little bit of energy, therefore a whole bunch of time, to form river valleys and canyons and sediments. And it's assumption which you choose to believe. Nobody has a time machine. But that shows exactly the same sort of things you see all over the West and all over the world could have formed very, very rapidly. Now you have a steam explosion pit. This time they're circular. Steam explosion pit, there's a helicopter up there for scale. 4 months after the eruption, there was another mud flow that came out of that opened up, ended volcano, and a whole bunch of mud came screaming down through the valley, and it broke from pit to pit to pit, and it formed a brand new river valley. Now, 600 foot of sediment got laid down when Mount St. Helens erupted. And this mud flow broke through that new sediment and formed this new canyon where there's now a water drainage pattern, and there's a little creek that turns into a river inside of that canyon. And here's what it looks like. This is right after that mud flow. And as that water started to empty out, it now has a little creek down there. I was out there last summer to observe it. And for the first time, scientists could see all of this stuff, the stuff that flowed down the mountain at 100 miles an hour. What does it look like? And I think most people envisioned it was probably like sticking a blender in a bunch of mashed potatoes, and it's just all mixed up. Big boulders, little boulders, lots of rocks, and so on. Instead, this is what they found. See those perfectly flat horizontal lines? At 100 miles an hour, that mud flow sorted out the sediment into different densities, different particle sizes, different compositions, and it laid them all down in perfectly flat horizontal lines up and down the river valley. Now, the black stuff at the top is the ash that settled after the mud flow. So as you go closer, there's a person there for scale. You see the horizontal lines, and you go even closer, right down to the teeny little paper-thin layers. It all formed catastrophically and almost instantaneously. It didn't form slowly. And again, geologists are trained to think. They have a name for everything. They call these varves, V-A-R-V-E-S. And you will find places on the earth where you'll find 100,000 little thin lines like that. And in the textbooks, it will tell you, as a fact of science, this represents an annual seasonal change where you've had more sediment fall in the fall and it slowly gets compacted down into a very thin layer, and then in the winter you won't have anything dropping, and then the next year you'll get another one form, and you can count them up, and that shows 100,000 years of Earth history. That's what students are told. It's a fact. They aren't told there's any other possible explanation. These formed in a matter of minutes. They didn't form one per year. As fluid filled with sediment does what it does, it sorts it out into layers. So you have this little tiny river at the bottom of this great big valley. The river didn't carve the valley. The mud flow carved the valley, and it left the river. And you have tons of erosion that didn't happen over hundreds, thousands, or millions of years. It happened very, very rapidly as things collapsed right after the flood ended, and subsequent rains washed away the soft sediment. And by the way, within months, you could take a hammer and go pound on that sediment, and it's turned back into solid rock, just like concrete. Liquid one day, solid the next. So it's 600 foot deep, lots of erosion, big canyon, little river. It's a 1/10 scale model of the Grand Canyon. 6,000 foot deep gash in the earth, lots of perfectly flat layers, different kind of sediments, laid down as the whole earth was covered with water, bringing in sediment and dropping it off, sorting it out at different times and different levels. Now the next thing, and let me just see how we're doing on time. How long can I go? 10:15? 10:30. Okay, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Okay. No, I'm not going to go that long. Here's these trees. Remember I said the blast wave just snapped them off? Now this is a color picture, but there's no color left because everything's covered with ash. And that some of these trees, they're like 3 and 4 foot in diameter. Logging trucks, because this was a big lumbering area. Look at the yellow trucks just kind of tossed around like toys, like little kids' Tonka toys, but by these logs and the blast waves. And again, they just ended up laying all up and down the hillside. A lot of them got lumbered. They came in subsequent months and years and pulled them out for lumber, but they left a lot of them standing up there too. Some of them were carbonized in very, very unique situations. I'm not even aware of any that were petrified, because now you got to replace the carbon with minerals, and I'm not sure that even happened, but they're definitely carbonized. Well, about 1 million of them ended up floating on Spirit Lake. Now what you're looking at is a big floating vegetation mat of logs, and as the wind blows, see the surrounding hillsides behind there? There's no trees left. This was a lush northwestern forest. And as the wind blows, that big bunch of trees they'll literally blow up from one side of the lake to the other and move back and forth across the lake, kind of bumping against each other. Now, why is this important? Because here's another thing that's taught exclusively to everybody around us. And that is the idea that coal formed during the Carboniferous era of the earth, when dinosaurs were roaming around, somewhere from about 300 down to about 50 million years ago. That's the big coal forming era of the earth. And whenever you see dinosaur pictures, you always see them kind of roaming around in a swamp. It's super, super common. Now, why is that? Because they find dinosaur bones in the same general layer that they find coal, and there's coal all over the earth, so they figure the whole earth was covered with swamps. Why swamps? Because when a tree dies in a forest, it doesn't turn to coal. That's the basic reason. So folks who are denying a biblical viewpoint, they got to find some explanation for why do we find this coal all over the earth. The only place where a tree falls, and it doesn't within years turn back into dirt, is if it falls in a swamp, because swamps have very acidic water. And the acidic water keeps lots of bacteria and microorganisms and fungus from eating away and turning the tree, the long-chained organic molecules of the tree, back into carbon and dirt. So when a tree dies in a forest, it just forms this real thick organic layer called peat. And they figure, well, because there's so much coal over the earth, the whole earth must have been covered by swamps, and eventually something else happened, an asteroid hit the earth and all got covered with dirt. And all you need to make coal is to take grass clippings and banana peels and bark and just about anything, and if you compress it Under lots of pressure, that automatically elevates the temperature. And if there's some clay in there, it acts as a catalyst. You can actually do this in a laboratory and start to form coal within weeks. Just put it in a cylinder, add pressure, a little bit of clay, keep oxygen away so it doesn't burst into flames, and you'll start to form coal. So they think that happened all over the earth, but they think it happened over millions of years. But there's a problem. This black stuff is the peat. That's just dead organic matter in trees and bark and leaves and stuff that's died. And it hasn't turned into coal, but if you could take that stuff and compress it under lots of pressure and heat, it would turn into coal. Underneath of it, that is just shale. That's just clay and bits of sand and stuff that's turned into a rock layer. Now, see all those things sticking out of the peat? Those are roots. Roots grow and push and twist, and there's worms and animals that burrow around. And when you look at a peat swamp that's been drained, it's all blended up. All this stuff from growing plants kind of mixes it all up. But when we dig up coal, and I brought a piece here, it always forms flat layers. It's just layer after layer. Now, I'm old enough that my dad used to heat his automobile garage with an old wood coal burning stove, pot-bellied stove. And when they delivered that coal, it would just fall and it would break into sheets. It would just pull apart into sheets. It's like a bunch of bark or paper that's just been compressed and packed down. It hasn't been all blended up. So the characteristics of a swamp don't match the characteristics of coal when we dig up coal. Now, there was a researcher getting his PhD in geology from the University of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a big coal mining area in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, of the East. So there's lots of interest in coal. And he thought he would get his PhD thesis by coming up with a different idea of how coal formed, that other than the fact it formed in a swamp, which is what's taught as a fact everywhere. So he had this idea that he proposed, that maybe there's a big floating mats of vegetation. And you know, you can even have a mat of vegetation where the roots are so entangled, maybe it's just floating around and there's still things even alive on it, like mangrove trees and such. But stuff's going to drop off the bottom. And it'll form this layer of dead organic matter called peat, and then maybe a wave of sediment comes in, compresses it, and turns it into coal. And that peat's there because there's just these big floating mats of vegetation. Now, he didn't tell the teachers that he was a Bible-believing Christian young earth creationist and that he believed there'd been a worldwide flood, because if you mention that as a geologist, you're likely not to get a PhD. You're likely to get bad grades on the test because what you're promoting obviously couldn't be true. So he just kept it to himself while he was working on his degree. But he was developing a model that agreed with the Bible. Now, he did all sorts of work, gathered all sorts of data, showed with little examples how stuff could drop off of mats and would form a layered affluence, and showed how it could be compressed in a laboratory and it would form the characteristics of coal the way it looks. He presented all this. To get a PhD, you have to have a dissertation, defend your work before a board of experts. And he presented all his data, presented his model, and everybody there agreed that makes sense. It really does, what you're proposing, match the characteristics of coal. But Steve Austin said they had two major objections. Their first objection was that coal is so widespread across the whole earth. Now, this is a single coal seam. Now, some of it's just a carboniferous rock that has a little bit of vegetation in it. The dark black areas are actual real good coal that has formed good burnable coal, but it's all in the same rock layer. That single rock layer goes all the way from way down in Central America, all the way across North America, up through Canada, all the way into Alaska. Same rock layer. They said just that one coal seam is so widespread, for what you're proposing to be true, the whole world would have had to have been covered by water at the same time. And I'll always remember what Steve said as he was giving this lecture. He said the next words out of their mouth was, and we all know there's never been a worldwide flood. So it's a great idea, but it obviously couldn't be true. See, they don't have proof that there's never been a worldwide flood. It's assumed there's never been a worldwide flood. Because if there's a worldwide flood, it would have laid down the rock layers and the fossils rapidly and recently. And all of a sudden, everything that's being taught about genetics and biology and the age of the earth and history, it's all wrong. You can't have it both ways. So it's assumed there's never been a worldwide flood. For hundreds of years, people have been trained to think that way. But the evidence really fits it really well, and this is just one of hundreds of examples. The second objection they had is that we don't see big floating masses of vegetation. Well, I mean, we don't see it happening today, so it must not have happened in the past. See, again, it's an assumption that just because things are happening this way today, that means they've always happened this way. Just because the continents are moving at 1/4 of an inch today means they've always moved at 1/4 of an inch a year. But that's an extrapolation millions of years into the past with no proof. It's just start with a belief and interpret things based on your belief. Now, the other thing that was found, this is probably my favorite thing we learned from Mount St. Helens. Here's bits and pieces of all these trees that have been bumping and braiding up against one another, floating on Spirit Lake. Here's another picture. So this was 1979 when Steve Austin got his PhD in geology. He's went on to work for the Institute for Creation Research and do lots of other really cool discoveries from the geological record based on a biblical view of the flood. And then a year later, Mount St. Helens erupts, creating a huge 1,000,000 log floating vegetation mat. So he's out here scuba diving to see what he finds while the mountain's still smoking in the background. So he's looking up at the logs, sunlight streaming down through them, great big logs just bumping up against each other. And as he looks down, you just see layer after layer of waterlogged bark and bits and pieces of organic, debris that's settling at the bottom of the lake. Now, it's not coal, but all it would take would be a whole bunch of sediment landing on top of it and pressing down on it with lots and lots of pressure and heat. And that would turn it into coal. Exactly what he had proposed. But the other thing he noticed was that these trees are just bobbing straight up and down in the water. Okay, some of them, maybe 1 out of 100, 1 out of 1,000. And another picture, they become waterlogged at one end. Here's the two scuba divers, and they're just bobbing up and down like a buoy in the water. So they went on to do sonar mapping because they wondered, when they drop, do they continue to stand upright at the bottom of the lake? And by using sonar, they'll see little spikes on their sonar, and each of these spikes represents a tree at the bottom of the lake that is in an upright standing position at the bottom of the lake. And all of a sudden, Steve Austin was reminded of something else he was taught in his geology courses at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's the idea, and by the way, here's what's happening. You've got some trees floating flat in a prone position. Some of them end up floating in an upright position. Eventually, they become waterlogged and they come down. And as sediment continues to drop, they will end up standing at different levels. Like this one seems to start at a lower level, and that one's a little higher level, and this one started up here, and then sediment's going to continue to form around it. And they'll continue to be buried in that vertical position. In the textbooks for 100 years, and there's a park sign, or used to be, at Yellowstone National Park at a place called Specimen Ridge, where they have what they call a fossil forest. Now, here's what that sign looks like and what the textbooks say. Hundreds of years ago, in the area of Yellowstone, there used to be a forest, and there was a volcanic eruption, because it's always been volcanically active. And all these trees were snapped off, leaving some vertically standing stumps. And then slowly, over hundreds of years, soil accumulates, and then another forest grows, and hundreds more years, maybe 1,000 years pass, and you get another forest, and then it's wiped out. And then 1,000 or more years pass, and you get another forest, and it's wiped out. And it happened 32 times. And I've hiked this ridge, and it's probably 1,000 foot from the bottom of the valley to the top of the ridge. And all the way up, you'll see fossils, pieces of petrified wood, trees that have turned into solid wood. And on the way up, you'll see trees with roots that seem to come down, and here's the tree. It's turned to solid rock sticking up, and here at a higher level is another tree, and way up there's another level, there's another tree, all the way up to the top of the ridge. Thousands and thousands of petrified trees. Here's looking from the top down. You can see these trees down all the way down to the valley, way down there at the bottom. And students for over 100 years, they'll see this in a textbook, and it makes perfect sense. There's the data. I mean, how do you get one forest growing on top of another? 32 subsequent forests in only a matter of a few thousand years. It could never happen. And these are big trees. Some of these trees are 500 years old. And then you got to have another 500 years or more before you get the next forest. So it says in the textbooks that this represents in excess of probably 30 to 100,000 years of Earth history as a fact of science. Nobody had a better idea. It seemed to make perfect sense. Therefore, and sometimes they don't even say that, therefore, a biblical time frame of creation could not possibly be true. And that's how people are trained to think. And they'll interpret everything based on this rock-solid evidence that people could go and see. Except when Mount St. Helens erupted, all of a sudden Steve realized there's a better explanation. Trees dropping down at different times as the sediment is rapidly forming. And then once they're all buried, if it gets compressed and there's lots of minerals percolating through, it could turn those trees into solid rock. And then erosion would happen in that valley and expose those trees. So researchers started studying it, and they realized two things. Whenever you could expose the root bundles, they were always broken off. You see, these roots don't extend on out into the ground. And where they could find trees where they could see the tree rings petrified, in all the different levels, the tree rings would have the same pattern from the bottom forest on up to the next forest, all the way to the forest on up. Well, those tree rings, how wide they are depending on weather patterns. How could you have the same weather pattern 1,000 years earlier, and then 1,000 years later in the next forest you have the same weather pattern, and 10,000 years later you have the same weather pattern? These trees were all from the same massive forest that got washed in there and then got buried. And third, where they had fallen down, no matter which is the level, statistically, it showed they were all lined up in the same direction, which means all this stuff got flowed in there by a massive flood. So looking at that valley, I mean, here's Specimen Ridge. I'm standing at the top of it. I took this picture. It's almost 1,000 feet down there to those trees way down at the bottom. And then you go all the way across that valley and up to that hill on the other side. That's the same sediment layer as this. All of that dirt in that valley got washed away as the waters were washing things off of the continent, leaving these exposed hills. That's happening all over the world. Water's got to escape somewhere. It finds the area of least resistance. Rock that happens to be a little harder, the water flows past it, and it's removing loose sediment in between, leaving this valley. And then we get to see these petrified trees. But without a doubt, Yellowstone took down that sign because they realized it couldn't be true. But they didn't replace it with a sign saying this represents an enormous flood in this area that rapidly buried all of this vegetation and then carved out this valley. Isn't that interesting? The truth just gets ignored because the implications are too widespread to even consider it. A worldwide flood means this planet is young and has been recently created, and the world can't go there. See, the world is bent because of our fallen nature. Ever since Adam and Eve, when he sinned against God, did you see his response? He tried to hide from God, and then he covers himself with a fig leaf. In essence, he's trying to cover his sins. And mankind's been trying to do the same thing ever since. Make up a bunch of religious rules so we can pay for our own sins, which will never work, and then hide from God. And what we've seen happen over the last few hundred years is just the latest attempt. We're hiding from God by pretending he's so far back in the past that he's irrelevant, or he doesn't even exist at all, and one eventually leads to the other. Now, I want to end with where I ended last night, that God foresaw all of this. One of the, I think, most comforting things for me about understanding creation, and again, in sermon time, I'm going to hit this a little bit stronger, but all a scientist has to work with is time, space, energy, and matter, how it interacts, how it works. Science is just a tool to study the operation of creation. It doesn't tell us where it came from. But that means time is part of the physical creation. And there's a whole bunch of experiments that have been done in the last 150 years that show that time is interrelated with space and matter and acceleration. And if you're moving faster, time moves slower in your location. If there's more mass close to you, time literally slows down there versus where you're farther away from a great center of mass. And it's such a small difference that you can't notice it or hardly even measure it where we're at. But we've gotten so good at measuring it, scientists can take a clock, which is based on the movement of molecules, called an atomic clock, and they actually do these in physics laboratories. They'll put one of these atomic clocks on the floor, they'll put one of the atomic clocks near the ceiling, they'll do their lecture, and an hour later they'll show that time literally moved a little bit slower at the floor than it did at the ceiling, because the floor is closer to the center of the mass of the Earth. Same thing at the top of a mountain or at sea level. So, since time is part of the physical universe, and God made time, space, matter, and energy, God isn't part of time. It's why he calls himself the eternal one. It's why he calls himself the beginning and the end. And it's why from beginning to end, God predicts the future before it happens. He's outside of time, so he knows everything that's ever going to happen. He's outside of time, so he can spend an infinity of time designing a single animal, and he hasn't used a bit of time because he's outside of time. He can spend hours listening to us in prayer, agonizingly pleading with him to help us out and through our situations, and yet he can spend the same amount of time with every other 7 billion people on the earth. He's going to know everything that's ever going to happen to us. So if it's happening to us, he's allowing it, okay? And he says, trust me. He'll use it. He'll use it for some better purpose, but trust me. That's what he's saying to all of us. So it's really a comforting concept. And I love this prediction, and you've already read it, I'm sure. Basically, it says there's a philosopher that will come in this wrapping up period of history before Christ returns, the last days. And people will have this attitude that everything's always continued as it always has. That's basically the foundational teaching of modern geology, uniformitarianism. Things that are happening today have always happened the same way in the past, they'll always happen the same way in the future. There's never been a creation, there's never been a flood, there'll never be a judgment. It's a philosophical belief, but it's fantasy, because there has been a creation, there has been a flood, and there will be judgment, both personally and as a humanity. But in order to hang on to this belief, they will choose to ignore that creation really has happened. God formed everything out of water. That's what it says in Genesis. And that there's been a judgment of sin. Noah's flood was judgment of sin. Every time you see a fossil, it means death, which is here as a result of our sin, is the result. There is judgment. God judged the whole world at one point. Now I want to wrap up, because I had a good friend that said, you should never end without not just teaching, equipping, and motivating, but challenging people. What are you going to do? You've heard kind of I think, a very convincing evidence presentation with lots of evidence that this flood is real. There's lots more evidence, and the books are full of it, but the world around us is clueless. For the next hour during sermon, I'm going to show you this phenomenal way God has used me and a lot of other people to make a difference in the thinking of an entire generation of school children as we present this evidence. But you can do the same thing. We just can't use the public schools. I spent 4 years taking 18 45-minute teachings like this, turning them into a video series that wasn't just me standing with a bunch of slides, but I'm out at Mount St. Helens pointing these things out. I'm in the Grand Canyon. I'm at the Petrified Forest. I'm in science museums. I'm at the Goddard Space Museum down in Alabama, filming, and then they're blending in videos and animation, and it's got breaks for questions. Phenomenal thing to watch with your great-grandchildren and your grandchildren. And then after you watch it, send it to a friend in another church and say, hey, this would make a great Sunday school class. I mean, I'm watching you all. You know this is interesting. This is one of those talks. Instead of donating what you would donate for me coming and speaking, buy this video series. It's 18 parts. You can get all 18 lessons plus like one book. It's 10 items for $70. And you could impact the thinking of hundreds of people with that little donation. So put it to use. And I'm going to show you, every one of them has a little teaser, so you can show this 60-second teaser to get people interested before they come to watch it. I'm going to show you the teaser that comes before the one where I talk about dating methods and how we can know what the age of the Earth is, radiometric, radiocarbon dating, just to give a feel for the quality of this. So I'm going to run that, and then we're all done. So this is the Rocks Cry Out series. Okay. If it doesn't pull it up, and it's not, I'll just go to the file on my computer. I tested it in the hotel. For some reason, I just started using this new computer, and it made me use the Microsoft 360. So it sends everything to the cloud, and for whatever reason, since I just changed it, it won't let me show it. Okay, won't even let me get out. Control, Alternate, Delete. Hang on a second. I'm going to shut this down, and then I'm going to open up. Bear with me. Technology. Okay. And then I'll open up that little video clip. So we'll turn this off because it just locked up on me because it's looking for the internet and it can't find it. All right. So I'll just go straight to the file. Because I want you to see just a little intro to these Rocks Cry Out videos. Okay, I call them the teaser. So here's the teaser. Uh-oh, hang on. Just a second.
To pretend that God has always had death and disease.
I've got to drag it over to the other screen somehow. Hang on. I might need some help. There it comes. Okay, we'll try this. Ignore the bars. There we go.
To pretend that God has always had death and disease and bloodshed and extinctions in his creation is a great distortion of what God's word says. I often hear people say, well, it really doesn't matter when God created, as long as I acknowledge that God is creator. God tells us that creation is not just good, but very good. Method after method after method after method of determining how old are things, and time after time they show a recent creation. The central emphasis of everything is life began on Earth 4.5 billion years ago. That is the foundation of the whole philosophy of evolution and naturalism. We've got to go around an established system of training people to think in only one possible way. Millions and billions of years, evolution is a fact, and show them the beauty and reality of the evidence that supports a true biblical creation model of why we exist.
So it's just want to let you know that this is a tool. That and those devotionals, I think, have impacted the thinking of more people than anything else I have been able to do. So I just challenge you to put them to use, because we're living in an increasingly blinded world, and we got to get the truth in front of them. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes before our worship service. We'll start at 11 o'clock. I want to actually one-up Bruce here and say, rather than skipping your donation to his ministry to buy that and give it away, do both. Do both, yeah. Donate to his ministry and help him continue doing what he's doing. and then take up that challenge to either buy a devotional or the video series with the intention of giving one of those away to someone in your sphere of influence. So let's take a few moments. We'll just have a break. Let's mill around. We'll come back after a few.